Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Again, thanks for joining. So my name is Becky. I am a former Terra fellow, just like you all. I finished in June. I'm a communication strategist and writer with 2 decades of experience developing sustainability content, including for USAID and the United Nations. And I'm now looking to pivot to the climate sector like many of you. I met Maria at DC Climate Week in April, and I was so pleased to see that she also used to work in the USAID ecosystem and is now doing a lot of interesting work. So I will turn it over to her so you can hear more about all of that. All right, Maria, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today, Becky, and the Terra community. I'm really excited to meet you all and to get into this conversation. I do, because I am a consultant, have a few slides prepared just to kind of orient the conversation on what I'm talking about, when I'm talking about corporate sustainability specifically. But first, maybe I'll just go into a quick background on myself. Becky mentioned I took a bit of a circuitous path from the USAID space to the corporate sustainability space, and just wanted to give a few bullet points on where I've come from, what I've gone through, and how I got here. So I started my career out at a small DC-based contractor that worked with a number of federal agencies. So I got exposure early on to a bunch of different pieces of the federal government, got a look inside a bunch of different sectors and industries through that. But what really drew me to that organization was their work with USAID. I had not really had exposure as like a fresh college grad to the international development space, but I had been working in kind of a social justice-y field, and it sounded really interesting. And that's really all I knew about it going in. But I was able to, after a couple of years in that role, um, end up specializing in their USAID work, which led to me being on site, embedded in the Global Health Bureau with USAID, and then also doing some work with Power Africa in Southern Africa. And so that was a really great first exposure to the international development space and really kind of set me off on this course where I've just continued to further and further specialize into the topic areas that are interesting and important to me. And so from that position, I went and worked with another contractor on implementing USAID's private sector engagement policies. So working instead of with a bunch of different agencies, a bunch of different offices, working with one office on one objective to implement that policy around the world. So we had exposure to and talked with a bunch of different regional, local, national missions and bureaus worldwide. My focus was mostly in the Latin America context, but again, that was a really interesting project and a different angle to see USAID and just general consulting work from. That experience really piqued my interest in that overlap between international development, the public sector, and the private sector, and how those two interests can be aligned. And so, at my next position, after taking a brief break during COVID to get my master's in the EU, where, as many of you probably know, there's a bigger focus on sustainability in business and in public policy. And so that showed me that that intersection was a really great opportunity to work in. So came from that and ended up at another contractor where it was a very small organization and we just had a small number of pretty large public-private partnerships. So partnerships between USAID or MCC and big private sector companies looking to find some kind of mutual benefits through development work in mostly Southeast Asia, some African countries. The common focus on these partnerships was sustainability. So there was a lot of sustainable agriculture work, improving those supply chains so that, the people in these countries were benefiting from climate adaptation and making sure that they were going to be able to have their product and sell it in changing climate circumstances. But these big American companies also were able to solidify their supply chains by investing in this sustainable agriculture supply chains. And so I found that really interesting, but that was kind of the point where I wanted to see the corporate side. I wanted to see the decisions that these businesses were making. It was really interesting to see them work with USAID in these partnerships, but I knew their work was a lot broader than that. These were kind of select cases that I was able to see. And so that's the point that I made that transition to Agendi, which is the company I'm currently with, and we don't have any public sector work. We work with a few government contractors and some nonprofits, industry organizations, but the vast majority of our clients are big multinational companies. And so we're offering them that full range of sustainability services, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple slides, what that actually looks like. And then we have a small number of research and kind of innovative projects in emerging sectors. My flavor of the day is in the clean fuels, biofuels space, which after this big, beautiful or ugly bill, however you want to talk about it, is increasingly important. But that's my background. If I can shift really quickly to talk about Agendi, just so you get an idea of who we are, what we do. We're a pretty small firm, but we are a specialist sustainability and climate strategy consulting firm. We serve, like I said, mostly organizations, big organizations, but we do work across size and industry. We're industry agnostic, so we're working with a ton of different companies doing a ton of interesting things. We're headquartered in North America, in New York, which is where I'm based. We also have offices in San Francisco, London, the EU. So we're globally distributed despite being a little bit small, but that's super helpful to us as the global landscape of sustainability regulations and voluntary frameworks is ever evolving. So we're able to keep our finger on the pulse. We primarily work with our clients to build their knowledge and capacity on climate action within their organizations, to understand their impact through greenhouse gas inventories, because you can't manage what you don't measure. So that's kind of the building block to all the work that companies do. We work with them on strategic planning by doing materiality assessments, figuring out what's the material E, S, or G topic to their organization. We're also working on that emission reduction target setting with the SBTI. We're also looking at enabling action. So you've measured your emissions, you've set a target to reduce them, but how do you actually do that? So we're looking at net zero target planning. And then the big bucket at the end is supporting on reporting and disclosure across that vast landscape of frameworks and standards, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. One thing I'll note is that we do practice what we preach. You see there on the left, we're B Corp certified. We have our own science-based emission reduction targets, and we work with CDP, which is one of the leading frameworks of climate disclosures. So I know we're all here for the same reason, but I do want to kick us off by just giving a bit more insight into what I mean when I talk about corporate sustainability. So we're all aware that climate change is a driver of global action, but the motivations for for-profit businesses to take action, at least to me, can sometimes be a little bit less obvious than kind of the altruism and just caring about the planet. So what is driving this work? When we're working with our clients on their sustainability goals, we're hearing about these common business drivers again and again. And so, of course, up at the top left, plenty of that work begins with a regulatory mandate. Companies are subject to national, state, local, international sustainability disclosure laws, and that's really what's pushing them to measure, report, manage their emissions to ensure compliance. The second best driver is external pressure from investors. That's pushing sustainability action within organizations to kind of meet those demands. Despite what's going on in politics or the news, I think smart investors do understand that there are key sustainability indicators like environmental or workforce implications on a business's operations that can lead to key risks or opportunities. And so they want to have that fullest picture when they're making decisions about where to put their money. Voluntary reporting to performance and ratings agencies like CDP, like I mentioned, is increasingly becoming a top driver of organizational action. It's marks a reflection of their commitment to their stakeholders, and we're working with a lot of companies to obtain and display the highest scores possible. A lot of companies, not all, are also thinking about how they represent themselves internally and externally to current and prospective employees. So since disclosures have become increasingly commonplace, employees and customers and potential employees, they have access to more information about an organization's sustainable business practices or lack thereof. And I think a lot of people are making hiring and buying decisions accordingly. Kind of moving down the list in order of how seriously companies are taking this. But some companies are paying attention to that time value of carbon. There's a greater benefit from reducing greenhouse gas emissions now than in the future. So if they're emitting 1 ton of carbon now, that might require a 10 to 15 ton reduction in 5 years to have the same climate impact. So if they do have those sustainability goals, acting now, acting proactively, is going to be better in the long run for everyone. Finally, all of these pieces come together typically to create this responsible business strategy. All stakeholders in a company's value chain, from employees, investors, external, internal, can motivate a company to understand and address their climate impact. So no one company is alike. They all have a different combination of those drivers, but they are all feeding together. On the right-hand side, those risks and impacts, kind of a subset of what we were talking about on the left, is also a big driver. Of course, again, a company's specific risks and impacts are unique to them. If they have a large physical footprint versus they're remote and distributed, they're going to have different physical risks versus transition risks. But they're looking at those operational and value chain risks that can come in the form of changing weather patterns that can disrupt production or distribution, to poor workforce management and beyond. They're thinking about, how is climate change going to affect my operations and my value chain? All of these risks can also lead to a direct increase in operational costs, right? So for example, as companies are working to rebuild their physical production sites, they might have reduced revenues due to interrupted production capacity or reputational damage with customers or investors. And so looking back at all of these drivers, thinking again about regulatory drivers, the flip side of acting in compliance with regulatory requirements is that lack of action or non-compliance is a business risk, and you're opening yourself up to government fines or lawsuits from stakeholders. I've run through a lot there, and I'm happy to kind of pause and talk about it more. I know there'll be a Q&A at the end as well.
Yeah, no questions so far, but yeah, folks,
Perfect.
feel free to let us know.
Awesome. And so I wanted to look quickly at how this action actually manifests, this action taken by businesses. So I'm sure many of you have already dipped your toe into the alphabet soup of framework and standard acronyms. There are a ton of ways that companies are measuring and disclosing their work. So I'll just go through a few. In this graphic, we start at the top of the pyramid with those regulations, as these disclosures are largely mandated for all of those in-scope companies, so there's no working around them. Of course, that list there with CSRD, I think it's California seal, the UK, ASRS in Australia. This is not exhaustive. There's state and local level policies that are and incentive programs as well that are driving action. But that's really the top of the pyramid and a key driver. The next layer down, we're looking at those voluntary standards. And so thinking again about or frameworks like CDP, where companies can disclose their climate action, or align with voluntary frameworks like GRI, TCFD. And then finally, at the bottom, there are goals that companies can publicly commit to, including committing to reduction targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But disclosing essentially at each of these levels continues to grow despite the political headwinds. I'll have a slide at the end kind of talking about what I see the future of this space looking like. But you can see on the right-hand side that each of these frameworks continues to have a huge number of companies responding to and complying with them. SBTI surpassed 10,000 commitments this past year. Companies are continuing to set targets with them. CDP saw almost 25,000 companies disclose with them. And so it's a huge space. There's still a ton of demand to get involved in these frameworks. So now I want to kind of shift to how do sustainability consultants fit into this big landscape of tons of frameworks and standards? And the answer is really wherever we can to comply with all of those voluntary and mandatory requirements. Nearly every function at the company needs to be involved. And so, as I'm highlighting here, the expertise we're bringing, it has to be cross-functional. And so I pulled out a few of the key skills that we use over and over on the daily basis that I also think are pretty transferable from a wide range of jobs and career paths outside of this industry or outside of this specific profession of corporate sustainability. And I want to dive into those a little bit more. So I've mapped those skills against some of the common things that we're supporting clients with. So up at the top, data management, obviously a really relevant skill in most fields. It's really critical in sustainability when it comes to measuring greenhouse gas emissions or responding to a CDP disclosure. And of course, these are just a sample of the tasks, but bear with me. Both of these tasks require collecting a monumental amount of data and making sure it gets to the right place for these things to be properly completed. And so that data management skill comes in handy quite a bit. Stakeholder engagement, a key piece of pretty much all sustainability work since it touches so many departments and functions. There are some tasks like the ones I've highlighted here where stakeholder engagement is a more formalized step to completing the work. So whether it's a materiality assessment, which is mandated under CSRD in the EU, stakeholder engagement is a mandatory part of completing that work versus target setting, TCFD. They definitely require stakeholder input. How you're doing that is a little bit more flexible, but all of them require hearing from and integrating feedback from people inside and outside of the company to make sure that you're getting a full picture when you're completing that kind of analysis. Compliance, of course, is an essential skill when it comes to responding to those mandatory disclosures and regulations. I think if there are any government or government adjacent people on this call, you know that picking apart government documents and responding to them comprehensively and accurately is a skill all in itself. So being able to interpret and respond to those regulatory disclosures is super valuable to a company, especially as so many more of them continue to come online and evolve and change. It's a skill that's in high demand. Communicating work on sustainability, again, a huge part of the job, right? As most organizations are, they want to receive credit for the work that they're doing. Of course, in the past few months, this year or so, this has become a bit more of a complicated role, but that does make it more important than ever. I see a hand up.
So we are having some questions coming in, and I think this is a good place to pause. It's related to like the recent slides. So one person is asking if there's a cost increase, what influences companies usually to agree to ESG?
If there's a cost increase in terms of bringing on a consultant?
Um, or like to their bottom line. Maybe the person wants to, clarify, come off mute, but yeah. And then let me, yeah. So you mentioned knowledge and capacity building as an offering or service. Can you share more about that? What it is you do for the clients, what the clients are looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. So on that one, it definitely depends on the client. But since this field is kind of ever evolving, I think clients in-house, they want to be able to understand the landscape as much as they can. Not every company has a dedicated sustainability team or dedicated sustainability person. So a lot of that knowledge and capacity building is working with whoever their point person is inside the organization to make sure they understand the relevant pieces of work for their organization. So it's when we're doing a greenhouse gas inventory, for example, a lot of the time they're hiring us so that they can just send us the data, do the calculations, send back the results. But some of the time, and we try to enable this wherever possible, we're working with them to teach them how to do it as well. And so we're not just sending back a black box with the results, we're sending back a fully functional Excel worksheet with all of the calculations in there, and we're walking them through how we did those calculations. So we want to enable clients to be able to do this work themselves so that they have a better understanding of what we are working on with them. But again, it stretches broader as well, right? During that stakeholder engagement, we're talking to a lot of people who don't have sustainability in the forefront in their day-to-day jobs. And so we're trying to do education on climate and the importance of this work as we go, as we're meeting with those different people. So it can be either a formal, agreed upon part of our work where the client wants to learn how to do something, or it's something that we're kind of sprinkling in as we go and submit our deliverables.
Great, thanks. And then, yes, there was the follow-up to that first one. So the cost increase to their bottom line and their overall expenses as a business.
Could you do the whole question again
Yeah,
together?
there's a cost increase to doing this kind of reporting to their bottom line. What is really influencing companies to agree to these frameworks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the mandatory ones, they don't have to agree. They're mandatory. If they're in scope of the regulation, they have to do it. For the voluntary ones, things like CDP and SBTI, you can really be looped in by your supply chain. So if you have a client who's a participant in SBTI and has a target, they can ask you as a supplier of theirs to also set a target to help them achieve theirs. There's kind of a value chain system that works in some of these more voluntary frameworks to loop more and more organizations in. That's not to say that a lot of companies, even with the extra cost, aren't doing this voluntarily. They do. A lot of companies do take those risks that I talked about up front seriously. If they can do a climate scenario analysis and understand what the effects of climate change on their physical footprint are going to be in 20 years, they'll do that. They'll make that expense to kind of be able to plan and mitigate to the best of their ability. So there's different factors coming together that are driving companies to incur that extra cost.
Great. And one other good question, maybe by the same person. Would you say that previous experience in consulting is mandatory or preferred by employers for this kind of consulting too?
Um, I would say no, not mandatory. Agendi, I think, is really good at having people from all different backgrounds. We have engineers, we have environmental scientists, we have consultants, we have MBAs. It's a really, and that's kind of the whole message of this, that it's bringing together a bunch of different skill sets. I think another great thing about this industry is that nobody knows everything. There's so many different angles to it. You could come in from the more science and math side. You could come at it from the policy side. There's just so many different things happening that there's not one person who has all of the expertise. So whatever you're bringing to the table, I think there's a way to make it valuable and then to pick up more of these skills and more of this knowledge as you go.
Great. Okay, let's move on and then we'll take more questions at the end.
Perfect. I think I left off at communication, but project management, I think that's pretty straightforward and why that would be important. All clients need to be managed, all budgets, timelines, scopes of work, they need attention no matter what industry or field you're coming from or that you're going into. To take a look just one layer deeper, picking one task, so setting a science-based target as an example and how these skills apply. Again, that data management piece is going to be kind of the critical foundation to setting a target. To set an emission reduction target, you need to understand what your emissions baseline is and then what your emissions are yearly after that to be able to measure progress against it. And so that data management piece is going to be really critical in making sure you have all of that information that you need to measure progress against that target. Stakeholder engagement, setting a target is going to involve making changes across an organization. So different business units, different departments need to be involved and understand what's going to be asked of them to meet that target. So if they're going to need to change how they're doing something, getting their input before you set that target is pretty important so that it doesn't come as a shock. You get a little bit less pushback as you go. Compliance, SBTI, if you've ever looked at their guidance documents, there's a ton of information to comply with. And so that skill of being able to check things off and interpret guidance that may or may not be super clear is going to be really handy. Communication. Obviously, there's a public communication aspect to setting and communicating progress against a target. And so that's going to come in as well. And then the project management piece, you do have a specific timeline to both set and validate and meet your target. And so you're going to want to be able to plan in advance and be able to meet milestones along the way with that target. And so finally, before we just open it up to conversation, I know, I mean, there's the elephant in the room is that this industry is going through it. Not just this industry. There's a lot going on, but I did want to leave us on an optimistic note coming out of kind of the changes that have happened, at least in the US over the last 6 months. The survey results on the right, they come from the spring of this year, so kind of post-election in the US. And we're seeing that companies that have sustainability programs in place, they've had these in progress for years and they have years left on them. They're not scrapping them because the headlines are bad. They may be changing how they're talking about them, if they're talking about them at all. But our experience is largely that a lot of this work continues. It's just evolving, which it always has been. So I think there is reason for optimism for this work to continue. Of course, there are policy setbacks. The One Big Beautiful Bill, I think in the EV and solar space, we'll see slowed progress there. But like I mentioned up front, kind of off the side, it does open space for lower emission fuels to act as interim solutions. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is work still being done. And that's just in the US, right? We still have the laws in the EU, in Australia, in the UK. Lots of countries and regions around the world are still taking action in climate. And then in the US at the state level, there's California's laws that are going to come into effect at the end of this year. And there are other states looking to mirror those as well. So progress is still being made. Companies are still working on this. And that green box at the bottom, I think, is really important that companies are really seeing how sustainability is an integrated function across organizations. It's not a standalone department. A lot of our clients have been shifting from having a specific dedicated sustainability team to having sustainability experts throughout their organizations working with different departments and functions. So I think there's reason for optimism, but happy to close us out on the slides and have any conversation, answer any questions.
Yes, great. Okay, thank you. On that future note, we do have a question about AI. What's your take on how companies that are developing or investing heavily in AI are addressing its impact on sustainability?
Yeah.
Good comment.
Yeah. I don't have a well-baked answer, right? Like the environmental impacts of AI are obviously pretty severe. Sustainability is more than just the E in ESG though. But it's a tough balance, right? I don't know that I haven't seen a lot of examples of it being handled super sustainably yet. But yeah, I think it's still a yet to be seen issue, unless somebody on this call has seen otherwise.
Yep, great. Okay, so we have a number of questions on just, career transition and people just coming from different, areas, some entry level, some folks from development, nonprofit space. So before I get into those specific questions, let's talk about what advice would you give to someone looking to pivot to this space in general?
Yeah, I think um, on my comment about not nobody knowing everything, I think the amount as much as you can familiarize yourself with what is going on. So kind of reading those industry specific news sites, knowing what the hot topics are. So end of last year, hot topics were CSRD and kind of those EU regulations. That now has drifted a bit more into the distance and newer hot topics are coming online. So being able to have that conversation about what the top things are, despite the fact that there's a landscape of 50 different things you could be specializing in this space, that's a great place to start. And that'll help you, I think, in applications and kind of picking where to be applying and going through the interview process, knowing what's important to companies and consultancies right now will help you kind of angle your existing skill set to meet that need. So I came into the corporate sustainability space never having done a greenhouse gas emissions calculation, not being conversational on these regulations, but because I was able to frame my experience working with USAID, talking about the considerations in a sustainable agriculture supply chain, or really, I think the biggest skill that I spoke to was the program management skills and being able to manage a scope of work and a budget and a timeline. Um, if you can frame that around the work that is being done in the sustainability space, I think that's a great in.
Okay, great. And then more specifically, how do your consultants get training in all the complex tools and tasks to be able to perform the activities for clients?
Yeah, I can speak to how we do it at Agendi. We have a great kind of internal training process, and we do, for a small company, we have a great library of templates. So for things like greenhouse gas inventories, which are kind of our bread and butter that we've been doing a long time, or for science-based targets, which the process has been pretty familiar for a few years now. We just have that kind of in-house knowledge base that we're able to bring on newer people, junior consultants, and just help them along the way and walk them through that process on an actual client project. Um, for more emerging things like CSRD when it first came online, like it's a bit niche, but the book and claim market, where kind of sustainable aviation fuel and credits like that are being traded, nobody knows, right? Like it's still being set up. People were still picking through CSRD when it came out. And so that's one of the, I guess, a skill that you're bringing to it is the ability to kind of just dive in and work on it as you go with no formal training. There's no formal training on something that hasn't been written or developed yet, right? So I'd say the bigger angle is kind of coming at it with an open mind and just learning on as you go is a big thing in this space.
Great, thanks. Okay. Have you seen any companies implement HR like mandatory training specifically for sustainable practices to their workforce?
Good question. Not mandatory. We work with a number of clients who definitely they offer, it's probably more voluntary, but they offer webinars and they offer training support for their employees or their customers or their suppliers, whatever target audience they're trying to build knowledge for. Um, yeah, I've not seen any mandatory courses though.
Okay. One more question. That's the last in the queue for now. Do you work with companies and their suppliers together? You mentioned voluntary reporting when a company may ask their supplier to report. Can you speak a little more about those dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example I can think of is a big client that we work with who have their own science-based target, and part of that target um, is kind of like I said, you're looping up a lot of your suppliers and your supply chain because their emissions feed into your emissions, and so if they're not reducing theirs, there's no way you can reduce yours. And so one of the things we're helping them with is to engage with their suppliers, understand their own level of maturity when it comes to sustainability, build that relationship, have the client offer support to these maybe smaller suppliers on if they've never measured their emissions before, connect them with us and connect them with trainings on how to do that, kind of just offer them support. So there are clients that are kind of asking us to help bridge that gap between them and the supplier to kind of fill that knowledge gap. On the flip side, we have clients that are the supplier in that situation where they've had a big client ask them to set a target. They had no intention to ever measure their emissions or set a target outside of this request, but it's a big enough client that it's worth it for them to jump through those hoops. And so we're kind of managing that relationship from the other side and helping them respond to that requesting client and make sure that we're meeting their goals and but also considering that client's specific situation that they might not have otherwise wanted to be in this position if they weren't pulled into it, and so being kind of cognizant and tailoring our approach on based on that.
Okay, great. I hope she answered the questions adequately. If you have any follow-ups, feel free to let us know. On the topic of, pivoting and hiring, are there any trends you're seeing right now in hiring in this space? Observations, insights?
Yeah, I think when you and I first met back in April, it was just, I mean, the floor was falling out from a lot of us, and there was so much going on in this space, in the development space. Um, from the corporate sustainability angle, I think even just in the last couple months, things are starting to even out. People are catching their breath. Like I said, companies aren't throwing away their sustainability programs. They just took a beat to kind of refocus and figure out, okay, how are we actually going to approach this? How are we going to move forward? And so I can't speak to the hiring trends specifically, but I do feel that in this part of the industry, things are looking back up. Things are getting a bit more optimistic. People are refocusing. People are moving forward with their sustainability programs, and hopefully that translates to let's bring our sustainability people back into the fold. Let's get them back online.
Okay, so I want to stay on the topic of skills and hiring for one second, then I see Massimo has another question. So you mentioned program management and some of those transferable skills. Were there any others that you can think of for folks who may be coming from a more like generalist background, things that they may want to highlight?
I mean, it depends on the angle that you're coming at this industry from, right? Like we're the consultants, and so we have to be the multitasking, gotta have like the different, have to be able to do the stakeholder engagement, but also do the calculations. I think maybe if you're looking in-house at a company, especially the larger companies that have more developed sustainability programs, they might be looking for more specialized expertise in someone that they're hiring. So they might hire somebody who has that specific science background or who has that specific policy background. And so instead of having to kind of broaden and like be just juggling all the time, you could take whatever your background is and find that specialized role. I would think that's probably a more
Yeah.
rare case, to be honest. But it's not something that's it's something that's out there. I think we worked with a number of clients who have those kind of specialists in house and then go out to us for when they need broader support on something that that specialist doesn't specialize in.
Yeah, yeah. And there was someone who commented that they have experience in social science research. So I would imagine like those hard data skills, qualitative, quantitative skills are really
Exactly, the analysis skills. A lot of the European regulations, for example, they're really comprehensive and they require something that takes, I don't know, 6 to 9 months of study and analysis, and being able to set up that process and run that analysis, I think is a huge piece of it.
great. Thanks. Okay, so Massimo is asking, what are some tips on how an internal employee can become more of a sustainability subject matter expert in their existing company without being a hired consultant?
That's a great question. I would think understanding your company's own maturity and footprint. It's definitely not a one-person job, especially if it's not your full-time job to measure their greenhouse gas emissions, but understanding kind of where they sit in terms of sustainability. Where have they ever considered joining an initiative like the science-based targets, or have they ever considered disclosing? I think maybe taking a look at the CDP questionnaire, like what are these different topics and data points that companies are measuring and responding to, could be a really good place to kind of understand what the different things that sustainability teams are doing and thinking about where in your role that could fit in. Um, Maybe it's just not just, maybe it's knowledge building and capacity building within the organization so that even if measuring emissions or setting a target or responding to one of these frameworks isn't in the near future, it starts to percolate and just awareness of these things existing is a great start.
Okay, we've got a great question, in my opinion, about the intersection of climate and health. I also was working in global health before this. So, any suggestions for people coming from public health, global health, how to build a career at the intersection of climate and health?
Yeah. Um, Interesting question. I mean, it's so one of my clients pre all of the last 6 months going down was one of the big USAID global health implementers. And so thinking about their case specifically about how that intersection came together, they wanted to um, they wanted to be a leader in the sustainability space and have a really robust climate program. And I mean, it's such a specific sector of, especially in global health, when you're transporting physical supplies around the world and you're transporting experts around the world. You can't cut your emissions there, so you need to figure out different ways to cut your emissions. And if you're working in developing countries, there's going to be less renewable energy options for you to decarbonize your physical spaces. So it's a really I think it requires a really creative mindset. Honestly, it's a little bit less straightforward than decarbonizing a law firm that has offices in an American city. I don't know that I have any tips in particular other than being able to bring that public health knowledge and background and the specifics of how that industry works. Since it's so unlike a lot of other industries that might be more used to corporate sustainability, I think that's the real value add. Because if, depending on what your position is, if just a generic corporate sustainability consultancy is coming in, they're probably not going to understand the emissions that go into distributing vaccines in sub-Saharan Africa. Like it's a very having that specialized knowledge of how things actually work and how things actually operate is the skill itself. But I'm sorry, I don't know if I have any specific tips on like where to find that
Yeah, I
intersection.
mean, my 2 cents, my thoughts would be like looking at the big companies, like you're saying, the Mercks and whomever,
Mhm.
and like researching what are they doing. Speaking of other, recommendations, do you have thoughts on like resources where people can go to look at these different data analyses? And we can also try to just like send this out to people after the call if you want to. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the go-to like industry publications where you can see what the big news is and what's going on is Trellis, formerly GreenBiz. Um, CDP is a great place to start because it touches so many companies. If you're able, I think you can create a free account and look through their questionnaire, see what they're asking companies to disclose. Um, yeah, I'll think more about on kind of where the public facing resources are, where this information would be congregating. I think one piece is if there's a specific industry or space that you're interested in. So I've kind of been um, led down the path of cleaner fuels. Find those industry associations, find what they're talking about, because every rock that you turn over has just so many more layers underneath it. And so you're not going to be able to take in all of the information that's going in the whole sustainability space. So maybe find something that interests you and deeper dive there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And that's a common thing that keeps coming up in the fellowship. They present us with so much information, and you just have to find like what interests you, what you're
yeah.
passionate about. Okay, we are almost like 15 minutes at the end. I'll let people, think about if there's more questions, but I'm curious about you mentioned policy changes in the EU. Can you talk a bit more about what you're seeing in the EU, also here in the US? How are you seeing the situation changing your day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the EU, I think I name dropped CSRD a few times because that was all I talked about for the last 2 years. They at the beginning of this year they were getting pushback on their sustainability regulations as well. So the CSRD was this massive bill that required a ton of information to be disclosed, like thousands and thousands of data points. They required a really long process leading up to it to even be able to make that disclosure. And I think a lot of private sector companies were unhappy with that process. So they got a lot of pushback. And at the beginning of this year, they released a kind of omnibus bill that revised a ton of the requirements, pulled back a lot of the most stringent requirements, cut a lot of companies from being in scope. And so that was a pretty big earthquake, right, in what had been driving a lot of sustainability action in companies that otherwise wouldn't be touching it for the last couple of years as they prepared to disclose. But they've kind of righted the ship. I'm using too many metaphors, but they've it's all evened out, and they've just released the latest draft guidance, and I think companies are getting more comfortable, whereas like in the last 2 years, they were really unsure of what was going to happen. They didn't know if they were going to be able to respond to this because it was so complex. But I think a lot of organizations are a lot more comfortable and happy with where the CSRD is going in its new form. And so the European regulatory landscape is really evening out there, and it's setting a nice precedent for other countries and jurisdictions around the world. So I think I mentioned Australia. Australia and California have similar disclosure requirements now, now where they're asking certain companies to disclose their emissions as well as their climate risks and opportunities. And so that's driving a good amount of the work in the US and in Australia. And for those big international companies, for federal policy in the US, I mean, it's not great news. I think a lot of the effects of the legislation in the last month or so are going to be on that renewable energy space, so the solar, the EVs, and it's just going to slow progress down there, right? So companies that were looking to electrify their fleets or company cars, maybe that's not so much an option anymore. If they were looking to make big renewable energy purchases, they might think twice about, is there actually going to be supply? Is the demand and supply going to be really mismatched? So the pricing is going to be weird. I don't think we know how that's going to shake out yet. I will say that a lot of these companies that set targets 10 years ago, 5 years ago, those targets are coming due. If you set it 10 years ago, you've got an interim target to meet now. There's a lot of 2030 targets out there, and so they are going to need to find a way to continue decarbonizing, even if renewable energy gets expensive, even if EVs don't get the same credits. And so it's kind of, it's like I mentioned, looking at alternative solutions. So even if this bill takes a lot of those funding incentives away from those mechanisms, there are different industries, there are different things growing that can take their place. So if you can't get your electric fleet, maybe you're going to put some low carbon fuels in your existing fleet for now as you wait for EVs to come back online. So it's not good news. I won't sugarcoat that, right? But I think there are workarounds, and companies are going to find a way to kind of still meet those emission reductions.
Okay, we do have another great question. So with all these changes, how do your teams stay informed and on top of all the complex and detailed regulatory updates?
We have a really active group chat. I think a lot of, despite most of us not coming in with a specialty, if you work on something a few times and you get to know it at a small company, you do become a de facto expert and the person responsible for staying on track of this. I was that person for CSRD for a while. Now I'm on the biofuels train. So if something comes up in the biofuels space, I'm sending an update out to Agendi saying, hey, this is what's happening. And if in conversations with clients, somebody says, oh, biofuels came up in this way, we can have a conversation and they can learn more about what's going on in the space. But again, I don't know everything that's going on. I know the things that I pay attention to, and I see the headlines that come up in our group chats, but it's really a team effort of all keeping each other updated.
Great. Okay, one more comment came in. Okay, the person asking about resources. Okay, Hadar, I may just ask you to unmute. Oh, I think she's asking. No, I don't know. Let's see if I can just unmute her one second.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Okay, great.
Like, do you know if there are examples of private companies trying to lobby or push back on the slashing of subsidies for uh renewable and like sustainable development initiatives in the private sector? Like if there's private companies that are trying to organize around kind of pushing for policy to bring sustainable development back online and like EV. Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know of any formal public facing effort. I know that, individual companies, a lot of people had a lot of stakes in a lot of this stuff around. And so they're definitely, I mean, more quietly, there was, yeah, there were people pushing from different angles for different reasons against this. I think it's back to the communications piece, right? Companies are being really careful about how they're publicly interacting with the government on hot topics like climate. And so at least I'm not seeing as much formal, organized pushback as you would maybe want to see. But it doesn't mean it's not happening.
Great. Well, I think we'll close it out there. Thank you so much, Maria. Thanks to all of you for showing up, for your time and your very engaged questions. And I think that's a wrap.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.